in the private sector, where you are a strong player, what do you see as an effective board and an effective board member? What do you see? And I also want to add, what do you see as what detracts from effectiveness? What and things that deal breakers in the board? Thank you, Dr. Benson.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Obi. And thank you, Dr. Oditolu, for the in-depth analysis you have given. Sometimes it doesn't differ so much, but it will be important at this point to also let our audience, of course, remember that we have different types of boards. You have boards of private organizations, private companies, private for-profit, private not-for-profit. You have boards of publicly listed companies, and you have boards of government parastatals. All these different types of boards come with different dynamics. They also do come with different membership composition. So all that will affect the effectiveness of a board. Take board of a public institution, a government institution, for instance. Oftentimes, board members are brought in based on political affiliations, certain quota to be met, certain quota to be filled, not necessarily based on industry knowledge or such robust background, just to, fill some constituency, requirement, and so the board is constituted. The effectiveness you will get from such a board and the effectiveness you will get from a private for-profit board, for instance, may differ, okay, and would actually differ. So I think generally the type of board, number one is that the type of board in question may affect not just the composition of that board, but would also affect the effectiveness of the board, okay? Because in some of the boards, I think you also alluded to this in your presentation, is actually just to make up a statutory requirement. Otherwise, the CEO calls the shots in everything that happens in that organization. But the board is just there more or less to rubber stamp what the CEO is doing, take their allowances and walk away, So most of the time, it is the motivation is actually the board compensation in such places. So you will not, expect a lot of effectiveness. Now, when you come to private for-profit business, the boards of private for-profit businesses then also differ depending on the shareholders shareholding structure that you have on the table. I mean, it is very dynamic in that sense because the fact that a particular entity on that board has majority stake tends to give certain individuals a louder voice in the board than other members. And therefore, even it tends to affect the effectiveness of the other board members. Because these are sometimes you meet with what I tend to call activist investors. And this activist investor is a member of your board. That activist investor is all about, his own profit, his own gains, or you understand, his own opinions must count and not necessarily the opinion of the other board members. So in such dynamics, you limit the effectiveness of other members of the board. So the composition of the board, the shareholding structure in a private for-profit organization may affect composition and therefore may also affect the inputs of other board members in that particular board. But generally speaking, the board is set up, one, for governance, to ensure that there's proper governance structure in the organization, so that not one man is just taking the decisions on behalf of the organization. It is also to ensure that beyond governance, that the strategic direction of the company is maintained and ensured. So the board sets the tone and then the management team carries out the mandate that the board has already set. And the board being stakeholders, and like I said, sometimes shareholders in the company, the mandate that is set for the management team then carries some weight because they are the financial owners of the company in question in most cases. So if you really want a board, therefore, to be effective, there are certain board instruments that must be in place. I just call them board instruments. We can choose to call them, some other names. But you see, there is need for a board charter. A board charter in any organization helps to put some, measures in place to ensure that board meetings are held at, certain frequency intervals. It could be quarterly, it could be whatever the organization decides, but oftentimes quarterly. A board charter ensures what quorum will mean. A board charter ensures what the total membership of the board can be. A board charter sets so many things in place that helps the members to be more effective, on their job as members of a board. So the place of a board charter cannot be overemphasized. It's a document that every member of the board will have. It sets the policies of that board. It sets the tone for, the limits. It sets the boundaries for, how the board members should be able to conduct themselves, both within and outside the boardroom, so to speak. Now, leaving the board charter alone, you also need to have an effective board. You also need to have board secretary, board leadership in particular, the board chaired by, an astute chairman, heading the affairs of the board, but also the board secretary, usually the legal secretary. These are lawyers who, understand the requirements of the law when it comes to board filings, company filings, board proceedings, AGM proceedings, how things are conducted. So if you run a company and you don't have a board secretary that is actually a legal person that, understand board dynamics, corporate governance, and the rest, the board may be dysfunctional. The board secretary helps to coordinate the activities of the board. The board secretary sends out notifications when meeting is due. The board secretary takes the minutes of meetings. The board secretary ensures circulation is done at the right time. The board secretary ensures that committees are meeting and taking feedback from those committees and the like, and then taking those reports back to the chairman of the board, before the regular board meetings are held. So the place of the board secretariat is very important. The place of board secretary is very important. The other thing that makes for effective boards is when you have what we call independent directors. These are people who are industry players, who are custodians of knowledge in that area of industry, and who are brought in not because they are financial members of this organization as a for-profit organization, for instance, but they are opinion leaders in that field of endeavor, maybe your field of business. You bring them in as independents and actually pay them their board membership dues and fees because you want the knowledge that they carry to rub off on the impact your board is making in that organization. So when you have independent board members, they also tend to help moderate and bring some balance in the boardroom and make other board members to be a lot more effective than they would have been. So they create the atmosphere, they help to create the atmosphere within the board dynamics that help the organization to do well. At the end of the day, it is not enough to be an effective board member, whereas in general, the total outcome of that board and that organization ends up in failure. So if at the end of the day, just like Dr. Dutolu said, the board has taken decisions that eventually led the organization to absolute failure, then your name is also involved. No matter how effective you were on that board as an individual, the fact that the company has collapsed, the fact that the board did not live up to expectation, you are still an integral member of that board. So I speak mostly in terms of, effective board, effective boards of organizations, as against just an effective membership. And for you to have an effective board, everything has to work in synergy. The chairman of that board must be also tolerant enough to allow others to make their opinion count during board meetings. How the board meetings are conducted, is something that will also affect effectiveness of the board members, or generally discourage board members from even airing their opinion during board meetings. So the board proceeding itself, and this is where, like I said, board charters, helps to moderate those type of things. So a lot is involved in terms of making a board effective, or making making a member of a board effective. The general environment of the board, just like you have within an organization, where you say, oh, the management team is toxic, the environment is toxic. You can also have very toxic boards, even though it's for a profit organization, but each time they meet, it all ends up in chaos. Everybody wants their opinion to be the prevailing opinion. And every time there is always animosity. And then there's what brings about what people call board politics. There's always alignment of one person and two persons, three persons, against another. When you have such environment where people are divided against themselves, whether in a for-profit organization, whether in a not-for-profit organization, there will be no coherence. And because obviously a house divided against itself cannot stand. So it's always important to ensure that the board dynamics is coherent enough, is conducive, the board environment is conducive. Board meetings should be, dates and times that individual board members actually look forward to, because they know that, one, they will meet with like minds, two, they will have positive impacts in the meeting of the day. Their opinion will count. They will bring value to the table. So apart from every other thing that has been mentioned, I just thought I should also talk about these aspects of what brings about effectiveness on the board. Just as a way of rounding it up, I mentioned board charter, very important. Coordination of the board secretariat by the legal secretary of the board, very important. The role of the chairman of the board in helping other members to be effective, very important. Perhaps the other thing I have not mentioned is the fact that when a board, you don't have committees on a board, it also affects, the overall outcome of that board at the end of the day. It's always important to break up the board into subcommittees, finance committee, ethics committees. You mentioned ethical dispositions when you talked about effectiveness. Dr. Dutolu also alluded to ethics and all that. So some boards, create ethics committee, so that when a member of the board is going out of a line, the ethics committee can easily weigh in and get those members back online. You understand? You need finance committee and committees like that. The people, different boards, different committees. But most importantly, is good to put people in committees where they have core capacity to function, where they can bring all the values they can bring to the table, so that at the end of the day, the work of the committee then impacts on the overall performance of the board, because the work of the committee ends up at the board level, general board level, and then impacts on decision making, impacts on the direction of the company and the rest of it. Lastly, just before I leave the microphone, there is also what is called advisory board. We must also understand that some boards are purely advisory, and therefore decisions made at such board meetings are not binding, but mostly advisory. And what some private for-profit organizations have done is that outside of their regular statutory board composition, board meetings that they have, board structure that they have, the clever management people have an advisory board by the side. I remember reading about the case of the founder of GTB Bank, who had some, close, top-notch people, as advisory board members by the side, outside of his regular board. And that the advice he gets from such, advisory board actually helped him to shape the direction of GTV, in those early days. Unfortunately, he passed away some years back, but he alluded to the fact that the place of the advisory board, especially in a private for-profit organization that intends on doing well, cannot be overemphasized. So I just digressed a little on, just to speak to that, because I know that there are some private for-profit people that are in the room. So you may have your board. Your board is made up of your shareholders. Your board may have 1 or 2 independent directors, very good. But else, if you really want to lead the organization to success, you may need to also have an advisory board by the side, where you have thought leaders, opinion leaders in that industry who can guide you from time to time in certain decision making. Thank you. Let me stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Benson, for bringing that perspective on the board effectiveness. That would have been a different topic on its own, but thank you for bringing it in. That is very important. And I really agree with you, like what a comment somebody already made about shareholding structure. That is a very key deal breaker, as it were, because if what happened in First Bank, you can see that the shareholding structure really plays a strong impact on the kind of people that are in the board, and we see what happened there. So that's a very key matter that you raised up there. And I would have loved to ask a follow-up question, but I think I quickly do that before I get to Dr. Dutoru. Then the composition of the board as well is also hampers individual effectiveness, because I emphasize on individual effectiveness because especially in the public, in the private sectors and in the public sector, we have well-laid board structure. You have board charter, you have the chairman and the company secretary, you have independent directors, as is provided for by the Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance. These are requirements, and these companies follow it. But at the end of the day, you see things going wrong. So it has to do with the individuals that are there. And